The English Reformation was just a political revolution engineered by a tyrannical king who wanted a divorce, right? While this premise seems to make for successful Hollywood movies and easy answers for some Roman Catholic apologists, the reality is quite a bit more complicated. In a previous episode, we talked about the Lutheran theological influence on the English Reformation, and in future episodes, we will certainly delve further into the theology of the English Reformers. However, today we want to give the political explanation its due. Does the fact that the English Reformation included a significant political component make it any less legitimate? Too often among modern Reformed evangelicals, the political context of the Reformation era is neglected, and the political theology of the Reformers is thus seen as nothing more than a regrettable holdover from Constantine, having nothing to do with the safe theological discussions about soteriology or ecclesiology. There is no question that Henry VIII desired an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in the 1520s. There's no question that he became increasingly frustrated with Pope Clement VII's exercising of jurisdiction over the English Church. The real question, though, is why Henry VIII believed he had the right to push back against Roman influence, yet still believed in doing so he was part of the Church Catholic. This is what we will explore in our discussion today.
Welcome to Canterbury Trails, a weekly walk through the faith and culture of our Anglo heritage.
O Lord, our Heavenly Father,
England is first and foremost for us a home.
That which we are.
Forth now, fear no darkness.
One equal temper of heroic hearts.
grant that all our doings may be ordered by thy covenants.
It's the man who's only thinking about doing a good job or telling the truth who becomes really original.
Made weak by time and fate, but strong in will.
And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, for the joy of battle was on them.
To strive, to seek, to find.
Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
And not to yield.
You have got to be happy in those quiet moments when you remember that you are alive.
Amen.
Welcome to another episode of Canterbury Trails. I'm here today with Jared Lovell. It's just us today in our first non-guest episode in a while, but we're happy to be here and discussing probably something that's going to come up a lot. I mean, the dynamics of the English Reformation and the political situation that caused it, I think, is something that people underemphasize and also are confused about. I think you had in there this juxtaposition between some people critique the entire situation as just this insane king who couldn't control himself, and so he wanted this random divorce, and so the English Reformation became a thing.
Producer's note. At this point, a few seconds of audio and video were lost. Here's what's missing. And then, probably the more evangelical view is that there was no aspect of the Reformation that was political.
A lot of it was just, they were reading their Bible and they came to these theological conclusions and they kicked off this ivory tower debate, right? That's kind of where it started. But the political dynamics are not only important, but they're also informative about how we approach politics today. Because a lot of people think that, that church and state should be so radically severed from each other that they really don't have anything to do with each other at all. In fact, that's one of the things that we believe about America and the West in general, is that whenever the church, interacts with the state, it's always a bad thing at all times. And I think that the English Reformation provides an alternative interpretation of this dynamic. So, let's start there. Why is it important to understand the political backdrop of the English Reformation?
Yeah, the devil really is in the details. And so when you dig into the history, it's going to tell you a very different story, and it's going to be a much longer story than the stories we tell ourselves. Our memories tend to be quite a bit shorter. This is true even in America today, especially when you get into foreign policy issues. Usually, foreign policy issues begin with the last attack, the last thing that made the headlines, and there's no analysis prior to that main event. It's just, there was peace in the world, everything was good, and then a bad guy popped up and did something for no good reason, and then America had to respond. So if you are tired of getting those kinds of explanations and answers to more current events, you may also be interested to know that a lot of these older debates, including the English Reformation, also have a backstory there as well. And so the idea that once upon a time there was a king who wanted a divorce, and the church stood up to him for the sake of defending marriage against the licentiousness of a monarch, and that caused the formation of a new church, is just not it's a nice cartoon. It makes for, as I mentioned in the open, a lot of TV miniseries and movies come out, and they're heavy on the scandalous details there of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Makes for high ratings. I wouldn't necessarily say good TV, but it makes for profitable TV. But it doesn't make for a good analysis of what actually happened. And so oftentimes in the Anglo tradition, which is what this whole podcast is all about, this church that has made our tradition, the idea that it started with a divorce would lead some, I think, to believe, can anything good come out of a tradition that just begins with a licentious king? And if that's the proper question, then the answer might very well be no. But if the history is much longer and much richer, and there's a lot more details involved here, I think it is going to reframe the way we think of the English church.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, like we said, that we have this Roman Catholic critique of it and all that too. But I think one of the other things, one of the benefits that I want to say the modern age, but like the present world society, one of the reasons they like that narrative is because they can lean in on the idea that the institutional church, Christendom, is very hypocritical, and they can continue in the long-term project of basically abandoning tradition, abandoning religious heritage, right? Like that's another reason too, because they love to do this. They love to look at the Crusaders, the Constantine, King Henry VIII, all across history, and it really helps them buy into their Whig theory of history, that we're actually overcoming the past, that this is how stupid and selfish and narcissistic church functions were in those days, but now we've sort of overcome these, and it can really help reinforce the pietism of the present evangelical and even secularist age.
Yeah, I think you really keyed in on why there is a motivation here, even from the secular sphere, as to why lots of books and movies come out about this. So, and especially highlighting the scandalous nature of it, because yeah, if you can go back and say that everybody was in on what was a scandalous practice, everybody has always done this, then the implication, the unstated implication is all we're doing now is bringing out into the open what's always been. So in addition to this, I've noticed more and more historical movies out where there is some kind of gay character. And so that's this person was hiding it. So it's before it had to be hidden, but they were a bunch of hypocrites. Now we're just doing what's always been the case, but we're freely and doing so and being honest about it and embracing who we truly are. Where back then the sad thing was that they had to hide it. But it's always been there. So that I do think is part of the agenda, part that's driving this kind of narrative.
Yeah, definitely. And also, like, they can say things like, that's the problem with having a king. This is why democracy's better.
Right.
Because he's obviously a hypocrite and abusing his power, all of that stuff, right? So it fulfills a lot of different modern trajectories and narrative and all that stuff too. So let's get into the actual politics of the situation. So let me just read this question that we talked about. So most people know that the Pope would not grant Henry VIII an annulment of his marriage, and that created the rift that culminated in the Reformation. The fact that Henry appealed to the Pope seems to suggest that he recognized the Pope's authority in these matters. So on what basis does he reject papal authority after he doesn't get his way?
Yeah, so the Pope obviously is not new. The institution of the papacy is not something that came about 10 years before Henry got on the throne. We all know that the papacy was around, for at least 1,000 years. If you talk to some people, they want to say it goes right back to St. Peter. I don't think they have a whole lot of documentary evidence for that. But if we want to go back to, say, the 400s or 500s, there's a strong case that popes are being recognized, the Bishop of Rome, to be more precise, is being recognized as the leader of the church in a way. But it's very important to make a distinction between what that meant in, say, 400 or 500 and what that meant in, say, 14 or 1500. So back in the early church, the idea that the Bishop of Rome had a kind of precedence over all of the other bishops in the universal church was the idea that there was something special, not about him personally, but about the city which he represented. So in the earliest days of the church, you see, and by the earliest days, I'm still being relative here. I'm talking basically 2nd century. You start to see the emergence of bishops. Bishops that would be the head of the church in a city like Constantinople or Rome or Jerusalem or Alexandria, places like that. It kind of emerged organically. And no bishop was ahead of another bishop necessarily. Why Rome took on more precedence, more power in terms of deference toward the bishop of that city was because it was a larger city. It was the capital city of the empire, and it was the place where St. Peter and St. Paul were believed to be martyred. So people would travel. They'd go on pilgrimages to Rome. Even Celts would go on pilgrimages to Rome, but it wasn't to go there to see the Pope, the person who happened to be sitting in the seat of Bishop of Rome, but it was because it was this city where saints like Peter and Paul had died. And so with that, the Bishop of Rome, that position, carried with it a certain amount of deference. So you would defer, you would give honor to the person who held that position, which is different than what you start seeing in the later Middle Ages, where the relationship between the Pope, not only as Bishop of Rome and other bishops around the world, but Pope and kings throughout Europe, is a legal relationship. What the Pope starts to take on is the position of being the final court of appeal. So that people, if they didn't like what the king did in their own country, they didn't like the king's decision, they didn't like the king's laws or his ruling or something, you would appeal to the Pope, to canon law, to the Pope, and he would have a team of cardinals, a bureaucracy of cardinals that would render decisions that would overrule a nation's own leaders, its own political establishment. And so what you have, again, to restate what I said just a moment ago, is a relationship between Pope and King that is more of a legal one than it is just a matter of deference, respect, or honor, which is the way it started out. So you can't go with this idea that well, we always had the Pope. Well, we have the Pope now, true, but I don't think Francis, for all of his influence, for all of his soft power, if you will, nobody's appealing to Francis over a Supreme Court decision in the United States. There might be people who object to Donald Trump's executive orders, but nobody's appealing to Francis over Donald Trump and saying, no, we gotta check that with the Pope. That's a very different understanding, even today, of the Pope than what we're talking about through the later Middle Ages. So as much continuity as sometimes, a Catholic apologist will say, hey, Pope then, Pope in the Middle Ages, Pope throughout history. It's been constant continuity throughout. No, these are very, very different conceptions of Pope in the modern era, in the ancient era, in the medieval era. We're not comparing apples with apples by just referring to the Bishop of Rome or the papal establishment.
Yeah. And so how big of a deal was it that he would pursue this annulment and then get denied it? I mean, I guess another way of asking that is, was the Pope at the time, and I forget who it was, what
Clement.
Pope it was.
Clement the Seventh.
Yeah, okay, so Clement. So, okay, how much of a political decision was that? That in itself, a lot of people think, oh no, that was purely theological. It's like, no, that also was a judgment call that had to do with power dynamics.
Yeah. So this is really fascinating, and it was so fascinating for me when I discovered all of the backstory here into Henry's desire for this annulment. So if you go back a little bit, rewind the clock. So we're talking about Reformation era. Henry breaks from the church 1534 with the Act of Supremacy. But if you rewind the clock, go back to about the 1450s through the 1480s, you've probably heard of the 3-decade-long civil war in England known as the War of the Roses between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. So Henry Tudor's father, Henry VIII's father, Henry Tudor, Henry VII, emerged out of the War of the Roses at the Battle of Bosworth Field after killing Richard III of Shakespearean fame. That's probably a name our listeners would recognize. And he claims victory for the Lancastrians. He marries Elizabeth of York, who was the daughter of the previous Yorkist, the niece of the previous Yorkist king, Richard III, daughter of Edward IV, his older brother, and unites these two houses and ends the Wars of the Roses and establishes the Tudor monarchy in England. Well, Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was quite weak. I mean, the best he could basically claim is that my grandmother was a former queen of England. He was a half brother. His father was a half-brother to a king, Henry VI. Very weak claim, okay? So there's got to be some propaganda involved in trying to hold on to the monarchy for the Tudors, and that's what he did. Henry Tudor is going to create the Star Chamber. He's going to centralize power in England under himself. He's going to make his claim going back to old kings in England, which is more a mythical link than a legal one. And so he's got to build this up. And he's in a place in England where if you leave the throne to a female, you're going to just be asking for a challenge. And so Henry VII, he has several children. His oldest child's name is Arthur, and Arthur is the one who was supposed to marry Catherine of Aragon. He was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon. Who is Catherine of Aragon? Just for the listeners real quick, it's the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, if you've heard of them, of Spain. They're the most powerful monarchs in Europe at the time, throughout the 1400s. So this was a prize to be marrying Catherine of Aragon, and Arthur, the first son, is supposed to marry her. Arthur dies as a teenager. But there was real question about whether the marriage had been consummated or not as teenagers between Arthur and Catherine. And Henry VII, the father, does not want to send Catherine back to Spain. You know, you have this prize in England, send her back to Spain, the alliance is broken. So he keeps Catherine in England, and he's got a second son who turns out to be Henry VIII. Henry VIII is about 6 years younger than Catherine. When he reaches marriageable age, Henry VII is going to appeal to the Pope, Julius II at the time, the warrior Pope, and say, can we get a special dispensation from you in order to allow this marriage? Because under canon law, this marriage is illegal. Okay, you can't marry your brother's wife under canon law. So,
because
King Henry VII,
as a reflection of the rules in Leviticus.
Exactly, going back to Leviticus. So, Henry VII appeals to Julius and says, "Can we get a special dispensation? Here's the circumstances. Older brother was technically married to her, but he wasn't married very long. He died. Can you approve this marriage to my second son, Henry? And Julius basically says, sure, no problem. Grants the special dispensation. Henry VIII is married to Catherine, and they're married for about 2 decades, basically, by the time the marriage ends. So, for the most part, they had a rather happy marriage. It was not, Henry loved her. They had a good relationship, but the problem was she wasn't able to produce a male heir. She produced one daughter that made it through infancy, and she would go on to become Mary the First. Protestants would know her as the future Bloody Mary.
And let me just highlight something there. Let me just highlight something there. This is important. It's all about the heir being a son,
right.
Because the problem is not that he couldn't keep his zipper up, right? That's what they say. But there are many kings who had all kinds of concubines and relations with other women. So it wasn't that actually wasn't the problem.
Right.
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 Yeah. Like other kings have done that.
Yes, and including Henry. Henry had mistresses as well and illegitimate children as well. Mm-hmm. So the issue here is not, hey, I just, want to sleep with somebody else. He's already doing that. He's already sleeping with mistresses and has bastard children. Mm-hmm. And the issue, yes, as you mentioned, is the heir. I mean, if you think, I'll give you an example. In American history, we could probably think of a time that was a bad time in our history that we don't want to repeat. We think, oh, those were the bad days. Maybe it's the Civil War, Reconstruction, Great Depression, maybe something like that. In England, they had that time too. A time that they thought, these were the bad years that we never want to go back to. And they were a time of civil war between King Stephen and Queen Matilda. So this is going back into about the 1000s. So Matilda was the legitimate daughter of Henry II. I believe I'm getting my names right here. I believe it's Henry II. Could go double check that. Matilda was the legitimate daughter and heir to Henry II. And she was left the throne. But women on the throne invite a challenge. So every time, this is true throughout most of history, you leave a woman on the throne, you're just asking for other claimants to the throne to say, let's see if she has the guts for war, and challenge her. And so this happens throughout history. It happened in England. King Stephen, who was Matilda's cousin, will challenge her for the throne. It leads to a time of awful civil war in England. And throughout the Middle Ages, the idea of those bad times of civil war with King Stephen and Queen Matilda, never go back there for any reason. It was like the worst time ever. So this is the issue with Henry. His dad already had a weak claim to the throne, resolving the Wars of the Roses. And so he only has a legitimate daughter from his wife. And so he starts to believe that the reason he has not produced an heir is because he had married his brother's wife. He had violated canon law going back to Leviticus, which prohibits that. Now, some might say, hey, what about Deuteronomy? Deuteronomy allows for Levirate marriage, where you have the example with Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38, where Tamar was married to the first son, right? And then he died, and then she was automatically married to the second to produce children for the first. Levirate marriage. That is in Scripture, that is in Deuteronomy, but it was understood that this was Levirate marriage was a special law for the Jews in the Old Testament. The general rule is you don't marry your brother's wife, and that's exactly what canon law had stipulated for years, for centuries by this point. And so Henry's saying, I married my brother's wife, and the only reason I did was because this Pope, Julius, granted a special dispensation. So it shouldn't be a problem. I'm going to go to the new Pope, Clement VII, and I'm going to just try to get a reversal of that special dispensation. And all he has to do is say, yeah, that shouldn't have been granted. I'm going to grant another one. No problem. And this had happened. This does happen. Popes will grant these kinds of reversals, ending marriages. It happens in France with Henry of Navarre. When he gets tired of his first wife, he just goes to the Pope and says, hey, I want to divorce my first wife. I want to get rid of that marriage and marry Marie de Medici.
You have to have a legal reason to do so, right?
Right.
And
so,
he did.
Right, and so the legal reason there, this goes to the idea of annulment, which is the better word. Some people like to use the word divorce. Technically speaking, in canon law, this is an annulment. Mm-hmm. So the annulment is not the same as a divorce. It says basically the marriage never should have happened. It was never a real marriage. Right. So, he appeals in 1527 to get this marriage annulled, thinking it's going to be no big deal. The problem is that in the same year, 1527, the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles I, sacked Rome. Mm-hmm. Now, Charles I is the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's wife. He's, in other words, the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, and the heir to the Spanish throne, as well as the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, his lands were just massive across Europe. And his armies had sacked Rome. Why did they sack Rome? Well, because Clement VII, as Pope, was trying to get involved in what are known as the Italian Wars between Charles I of the Holy Roman Emperor and Francis I of France. Those two were battling it out over the peninsula, which is now Italy. Mm-hmm. So they're battling it out, and Clement was originally trying to stay neutral, but he was a Medici from the Medici banking family, the family that ran Florence. More about that later. But in order to secure his family's interests in Florence, he ends up siding with Francis I against Charles I. And that backfired because Charles I ended up winning. And so now Rome is at the mercy of Charles I's armies. And even though Charles I is not necessarily the one leading them to sack Rome, he can't really stop his armies. They've been fighting now. They're this close to Rome. They've been bleeding, dying, and suffering. Rome is plunder. That's how we get paid, after this long war. So the armies come in and sack Rome. And boy, did they ever sack Rome. They took all the gold, everything, where they also took hostages and raised a huge sum of money to have those hostages released. Pope Clement is at the point where he is selling his vestments to raise money to pay for the release of hostages at the Vatican. So, I mean, he is at an ultimate low point in terms of papal power is concerned. And here comes this letter from Henry VIII saying, hey, can you sign off on this annulment of the marriage? Well, the fact of the matter is, he's really in no position to embarrass the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles I, by signing off on on his aunt, who is now going to be cast aside kind of like an old maid, and not be a legitimate queen anymore. And he says, yeah, there's no way I could do that. And Charles I has his screws on the Pope such that he's in no position to grant that, which is why he's going to try to find to stall this process and to hope that it goes away, because he's between a rock and a hard place. Henry wants the divorce, and Charles I isn't going to approve of that divorce. So the Pope is going to refuse to grant it. But he got himself in this position by taking sides in the Italian wars, and that ended up backfiring on him. So that's the situation, and why. It's not about, the Pope standing up for marriage. It is the Pope in a very tough political spot, who otherwise would have granted the annulment, but couldn't, given the political situation.
But the other element to this, though, is that the king, King Henry was also in a tough political spot. I mean, if he had no heir, this would rip apart his kingdom, right? So he's operating as the representative of the well-being of the English people. Right. So it's not just his own personal, I need to sleep with someone else. It's also the entire integrity and well-being and future of the English people bears on my shoulders right now. That's the other element of this. And so he basically had to make a very politically oriented decision. And this is where people just get uncomfortable, because they are very anti-political. We actually live with a very libertarian mind. We have a very libertarian mindset where politically oriented decisions are somehow inherently bad. And Henry VIII is making a political decision. And because they can't conceive of this as a legitimate like justification for action, they therefore have to go into the moral realm, which is that he wanted to sin. That's what they have to do, because we don't think politically. But the consequences of not having an heir are disastrous for his kingdom and his people.
Yes, that's right. And I don't say that to leave Henry completely off the hook. Henry does not necessarily deserve to be called a good guy in all of this. He definitely was in love with someone else and was unfaithful to his wife. But it's important to point out, as you said, it's not that he desired to be unfaithful to his wife, therefore he wanted a divorce. He had already been unfaithful to his wife on numerous occasions. So the issue here is needing a marriage. And Anne Boleyn, the woman that he ends up marrying, who becomes his second wife, is the reason. She plays an important role in this too, because she complicates things. She won't just sleep with him. She won't be a mistress to him. He had already had her sister as a mistress, and Anne knew what that was like. Once you've been with the king, like, you're kind of damaged goods, and she says she wasn't going to give herself up unless, unless he married her. Furthermore, he did love her and wanted her to have his children, his legitimate children, his heir. And so yeah, this is not a defense of Henry as some kind of moral, virtuous person, but it is to highlight the political nature, as you say, of this decision. The idea of securing the realm, preventing another civil war, because the last civil war, which was very disastrous, about 30 years long War of the Roses, was not that far in the rearview mirror. So the idea of leaving a Tudor woman on the throne is about as close as a guarantee as you can get to splitting the kingdom again and ending your dynasty. So yes, this is a political calculation. That doesn't mean you have to agree with the political decision, but to understand that there are weightier matters at play here than just, sexual desire, which I know the modern mind has a hard time thinking about that. But it's true. There are much weightier concerns here than simply the king's sexual desires.
Let's talk a little bit about the way that God uses historical dynamics to accomplish his will. Like, I guess more of a Roman Catholic critique would be about how there were all of these Lutheran sympathizers who were opportunists, and they took advantage of the king's political situation in order to get their ecclesiastical objectives handled, right? Let's talk a little bit about that, because it's true that there were these collections of interests that could kind of culminate in this singular decision, right? But I don't know that that's such a bad thing, because politics is part of God's theater. And yes, Henry, maybe for his own reasons, was making these politically oriented decisions, but I don't think that there's anything wrong with the theologians and the clergymen within his reach to encourage this path in order to reform the Church of England. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because I don't see why that's a legitimate critique, because of course God can use politics. It's all part of the stage, right? And so good things can come from prudent clergy action. How's that?
Right. Well, I mean, just go back to the New Testament. The idea that the incarnation and the New Testament all came about without any political involvement whatsoever. I mean, that's a joke. How is it that the gospel could be spread so quickly over the entire Roman Empire? Well, it's because of the political fact that Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, and the Hellenistic age provided a common language that allowed for the transmission of messages and ideas much faster across the known world than they ever could before. because the Romans won various battles and spent money on roads, you had the Roman Empire linked together where information could travel. You had information, kind of an information superhighway of the ancient world with those Roman roads. I mean, even Luke in the Gospel of Luke talks about this when he introduces the Nativity, right? In Luke 2, it's in the days of Caesar Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria that that Caesar Augustus determined the whole world should be taxed, or the whole empire should be taxed. Well, right there, he's situating the fulfillment of prophecy that the Savior would be born in the house of bread in Bethlehem. And he's situating that in light of a political decree that Joseph, who was of the house and lineage of David, would travel down from Nazareth, where he was currently located, so that he could be in Bethlehem, where the Savior was to be born at the fullness of time. So, again, these are political situations or political events that provide the context wherein Christ is born, wherein the gospel is spread, and we see this in St. Paul as well. You know, St. Paul strategically uses his Roman citizenship time after time for his ends. He appeals to Caesar. That was a right under Roman law to appeal to Caesar in order to get himself a free ride to Rome. Mm-hmm. And then in Philippians, I believe, toward the end of Philippians, he's saying that he has been preaching to the household of Rome. He's among the guards right in the belly of the beast, preaching the gospel, and people are being converted. He uses that in Philippi as well. You know, when they arrest him because he had cast the demon out of the fortune teller, and they start beating him, and he says nothing. That's what's so fascinating in that story in Acts 16. Paul and Silas say nothing as they're sitting there getting whipped. Mm-hmm. He could at any moment just said, hey, Roman citizen, can't do that. Doesn't do it. Spends the night in jail. Of course, the earthquake comes, and he's freed, and he, ministers to the jailer, right? And that whole family is baptized, and then the next day, they say, okay, we're going to let you go. And he's like, hold on a second. I'm not leaving just yet. I'm a Roman citizen. And then he drops this bomb on them, which I just find so amusing. Like, why is he telling them now? And I think what he's doing there is saying, I've got something on you. You beat me yesterday. You whipped me. I'm a Roman citizen. You had no right to do that. I'm not in a hurry to leave now. And I think he's buying some room for the newly created church in Philippi to function without being meddled with. So, there's so many examples I think you can point to, even in the New Testament, where these political situations create the context in which the gospel can be spread. And so I think we should apply the same even to the Reformation. The idea that there are political factors involved, and that shrewd, that's the word Jesus uses about the shrewd manager, right, in the parable, and being wise as serpents but innocent as doves. These shrewd reformers also use the political powers that be to their own advantage, and I don't think that takes anything away from their theology.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, you and I both have sort of a libertarian background, and we, used to treat very poorly the idea that somehow the state should be involved in some of these things like marriage, in some of these theological debates that would have we would have been aghast at the suggestion. But now you realize that we actually live in a very political world, and that these things are made by God, that the king plays a role within the overall structure of society. And when I say the king, of course I mean, whatever magistrate, whatever system of government, So it's important to realize that this isn't this like people like Murray Rothbard would blame the Reformation for bringing the state into society, whereas before it was this alleged, free market situation where the Pope, because it was a voluntary structure, that was legitimate, but then the king made this decision, and that was like the rise of totalitarianism and stuff. I mean, that's goofy. I know we're getting off track here, but it's just making me, think about these things that we actually do need to be okay with thinking politically, and that God can use that not only for social development, but also for the well-being of his church.
Yes, that's, I think, one of the weaknesses in Rothbard's analysis on all things Reformation is because he doesn't recognize that power is still being exercised in the Middle Ages, even if it is not to this by a state so much.
Right.
Now, there's a lot
to our. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
There's a lot to commend about the Middle Ages. I do so all the time. I think the Middle Ages is a time worthy of further study, where you have power that is really decentralized because there's so many alternative authority sources besides the state. You have the guild, and you have the church, and you have the nobility, and you have all these various other institutions that check and balance each other, rather than the state taking over all of these sources of authority. So there's much to commend about the Middle Ages. But what sometimes is missed is the idea that just because the state isn't exercising power doesn't mean that that power isn't being used. And what you often find in the Middle Ages is the church exercising that kind of civil power. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that Henry is responding to here is a long history of the accretion and accumulation of papal power. Yeah. And so I think that is worth discussing as well, is this background of, I mentioned toward the beginning of the episode, what is the difference between the Pope in, say, 400 and the Pope in 1400? What has happened there? And there are really some key events that occur and by which the Pope is going to insert himself into the legal affairs of England. And so England, going back to the beginning, I think we talked about in episode 2 a little bit about how Christianity went to England very early. In England, the British Isles, the Celtic Church always thought of themselves as a legitimate, distinct church from the Roman Church for that reason. And that continued down through the Middle Ages, and because that continued, you had a lot of heads butting between, say, English kings and the Pope. And what you see is the Pope repeatedly trying to be the ultimate ruler over England and make the king kind of his serf or his vassal. And because of that process, and we can highlight, there's a couple of key events. I think our listeners probably have heard names or are somewhat familiar with these events, but never actually thought about them in terms of church-state relationship and how the Pope is involved. So maybe if we could highlight a couple of those events. So perhaps you heard of Thomas Becket. The murder of Thomas Becket, the murder in the cathedral. I think there's a movie by that title. So Thomas Becket, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, was killed by the King of England indirectly. So for those familiar with the story, the king said something like, can't anybody rid me of this thorn in my side, basically. I'm paraphrasing Becket. Because why is he saying that? Becket, as Archbishop of Canterbury, refused to comply with the constitutions of Clarendon. Mm-hmm. So these laws were passed basically saying the King of England is sovereign in the realm of England, and that all criminal activity is subject to the King of England. So it doesn't matter who you are, you go through the same legal system. Okay? Which is what we have in America, right? We have, if you live in a state under state law, the state is sovereign over all of those crimes. There isn't another, you can't say, oh, sorry, I got my pass here, and that excludes me from the laws of this state or the laws of this nation. And so the problem at the time was that the church had carved out for itself basically an exception to the rule of law. Mm-hmm. Saying, if you commit a crime in England, the church will act as your court, and it'll go through church courts, but not the state. Mm-hmm. So the king has no control. So you can commit murder. Say you were a priest or a monk. you robbed somebody, committed murder, committed rape, something like that, you could literally pull out your card and say, this is my church card. The church will take care of it. Sometimes the church did. Sometimes the church didn't. So Becket is basically saying that the church has authority even to enforce laws relating to crimes over its own people. We're excluded from state law.
Yeah.
And so...
was he...
yeah.
Did a case come up where this actually became a problem, or was this just theory? This is
mostly, I would say, theory.
Okay.
That
and he just kept pushing in on the point,
right?
Which was undermining the sovereign claims of the king.
Right. So the king makes this statement, and some of his guards go out, and as the story goes, they find Becket in the cathedral, and they end up killing him. And this is a huge embarrassment to the king, because Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, has been, murdered by a king, and it looks from, the Roman Catholic perspective, he's just standing up to the state.
Right.
That's why he
becomes a libertarian hero.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. So, but so the king, from a PR perspective, is in really deep water, and so he ends up 2 years later after this murder having to agree to this compromise known as the Compromise of Avranches, and in it, he says, "I give up final appeal to the Pope." So he had to agree that any legal matters that are appealed over his head, he's got to let those matters go to the Pope. So now the Pope is now, in his team of cardinals, are like the Supreme Court of England. All right? So now you're going beyond national sovereignty. It would be like somebody here appealing to the UN over the head of the president. Right? We wouldn't want that. And it would be a challenge to national sovereignty. And so this is why, when you get to Henry VIII, the restraint of appeals is a piece of legislation that's passed just the year before Henry separates from the Bishop of Rome. And that's what he refers to him as, by the way. He says, you're the Bishop of Rome, all well and good. You have authority in Rome, but we have an Archbishop of Canterbury here. And if we go back to the ancient church, the bishops were all considered to be equal. And so before he does that in 1534 under the Act of Supremacy, you get the Act of Restraint of Appeals saying no more are Englishmen allowed to appeal to Rome. Rome is not part of our country. And so it was a move towards national sovereignty, undoing what had been created in the Compromise of Avranches after the murder of Becket. So, again, this is not, if you understand the Becket background, it certainly, whatever your opinion of Henry and this act, it certainly is going to change your calculation a little bit. It's not just an arbitrary move by a king, but a reclamation of national sovereignty.
Yeah, so, I mean, is that, what is the Roman Catholic critic of Henry VIII's decision to separate from Rome here? Is it that he's going against canon law? Is he going against, what's the claim here? That he did something, and I guess that's the specific question. Is this a theological debate, or is this a legal debate from their perspective?
I think they would conflate the legal and theological. So it is a legal debate, but it's based on the theological claim that the Bishop of Rome is the heir to St. Peter. So if you believe that the Bishop of Rome holds this title and everything that it entails as the Vicar of Christ on earth, then it is the kings of the world, it is their duty to submit to that. In fact, Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, he was one of the most powerful popes in the Middle Ages. So Innocent is right around the time of what you would think of Robin Hood stories and Magna Carta and all of that. You get the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And so he was probably the best figure you could say. The papacy at its height was under Innocent, and when Innocent became Pope, when they put the crown on his head, they basically said, you're the King of Kings, the ruler of rulers, and you have the right to govern the kings of the earth. And this was in the late 1100s when that happened. But then, if you go to about 1302, right at the beginning of the 14th century, there with Pope Boniface VIII, you get the papal encyclical Unum Sanctum. Mm-hmm. So that might be a familiar term to some of our listeners, Unum Sanctum, which supplies the theological basis for this legal claim. So in Unum Sanctum, what you get is the two swords doctrine. Mm-hmm. So the two swords doctrine says that it's an appeal to Luke 22. So Luke 22:38, I believe. It's this passage where Jesus is about to be betrayed and crucified, and he makes this, it's kind of this offhand comment where the disciples say they have two swords, and Jesus responds, "It is enough." And he's trying to prepare them for what's going to come. He's going to be taken, he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be crucified, and he says these two swords are enough. And so what happens in the Middle Ages is the development of this two swords doctrine. The church is believed to represent one of those swords, and the state the other. Mm-hmm. All well and good as far as that goes. However, the way this gets construed is under Unum Sanctum is saying the church has one of those swords directly from Christ. The other sword goes to the state, but indirectly from Christ. Because it's the church, as through the vicar of Christ on earth, the Pope, who grants the legitimacy to the state. Right. So, what you have at the end of the day with Unum Sanctum is the church controlling one sword all the time, and then getting determined who gets to use the other sword and how they use it.
Yeah, it's like a delegated power, right?
Right. Yes, right. So rather than those two swords being delegated directly by Christ to the church and directly by Christ to the state, one goes to the state, one's delegated, or one goes to the church and one's delegated to the state through the church, which places the church over the state. Because if the state does something that contradicts the church, what the church then does is places the state under interdict. So, and this is what happens with, King John. So if you know Robin Hood fame, Richard the Lionheart and King John. So Richard the Lionheart is off in the Crusades. All of that is true. He's taken captive on his way back, and then there's Prince John, who then becomes King John, who replaces him later. And King John gets into this major argument with Pope Innocent. And the argument is over the appointment of a bishop named Stephen Langton. The Pope wants Stephen Langton to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury, and John does not agree to this. And so the Pope just says, okay, I'm going to place the whole kingdom of England under interdict, which means no communion is to be served in the whole realm of England. King John is no longer a legitimate king in the Pope's eyes, which means the people have a right to overthrow him, come after him, kill him, and they will suffer no penalty for murder or regicide or anything like that from the church. It's totally legitimate to do this. This is a major trump card that the Pope would use often. The other famous example of this is Gregory VII with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, if you know the story about Canossa. And that was a famous one in about right around 1075, right in there, 77. But this is a major trump card that the Pope has, is you could place a whole kingdom under interdict. Mm-hmm. And so that's what he does with King John. King John starts getting nervous because he's in a compromised position, and he bends the knee to the Pope. And he yields the whole kingdom of England to Pope Innocent as his fiefdom. And then the Pope hands it back to John and says, okay, you as King of England, you're my vassal and you manage it for me. Mm-hmm. So now you have a
So is
situation where the Pope is over the whole realm of England.
Is that
And
the
so
same
when-
dynamic up? Was that ever changed, or was that the same dynamic leading up to Henry VIII?
It was okay. So it was definitely challenged, and it was challenged with probably another famous event our listeners have heard of, but just didn't think about how the Pope figures into this: Magna Carta.
Right. Okay.
So when you had Magna Carta in 1215, oh, by the way, what's interesting is Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton, because the Pope got his way, comes back, becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. Well, Stephen Langton takes the side of the nobles just a few years later in 1215 for Magna Carta. When the nobles rise up against King John, Langton's on the side of the nobles. And what the situation's changed because King John is the vassal of the Pope's going to back John against the nobles in Langton.
Right.
So this already complicates the idea, the kind of libertarian idea that the church is just fighting the state. In this case, you have the church backing the state because that's the one, King John is the one the Pope controls now. And so the nobles are pushing back against King John with Langton's support, and they force King John, of course, to sign Magna Carta. What does the Pope say? Magna Carta is not valid. He's just my vassal. They don't have these rights. So the Pope is actually against Magna Carta with Innocent, which is, again, not a perspective that you often hear. But, this conflict between state and church in England, and England always kind of pushing back against too much papal interference, is a theme you can see even in the famous Norman invasion, 1066. When William the Conqueror goes into England, he does so with the backing of the Pope, because the claim was the England's fallen away. They're not as Christian as they used to be. So we're going to Christianize England, reform England. And in that, and William the Conqueror goes in there as a kind of legate, if you will. I'm using that word loosely, but backed by the Pope to go in there and take over the kingdom. And then what's funny about this is William the Conqueror will turn around. He'll turn on the Pope once he's in power and say the Pope has no authority within this realm of England. So this idea that England is separate, that Anglo culture is separate from the rest of the continent, that the Pope can only go so far here. And sometimes the kings are weaker, like the king was, King Henry was with Becket, where he's in a position where he has to compromise, or his reputation's down the drain. And sometimes they're stronger, and when they're stronger, they're going to draw on these ancient ideas that England is separate, that we have our own church here, and that we're not subject to the Bishop of Rome. In fact, Henry VIII, getting back to Henry VIII, if you recall, his first chancellor was Thomas Wolsey. And Thomas Wolsey was doing the king's bidding. He was a good friend of the king for a long time, trying to make this annulment happen. But finally, the king got fed up with him because he wasn't producing any results. The nobles in England didn't like Wolsey because he came from really common origins and now had more power than all the nobles. And so they start whispering in the king's ear, and they end up, the king decides to turn on Wolsey and arrest him. Now the charges were trumped up. The charges weren't legitimate against Wolsey. But it's interesting what the charges were. The king drew on a centuries-old law that was still on the books, that hadn't been enforced very often, which basically said papal legates, papal representatives, cannot interfere with the laws of England. And so he charged Cardinal Wolsey with interfering with the laws of England. And again, it's a trumped-up charge, but what's most important, I think, about that is that it's on the books. Mm-hmm. It is there to be appealed to. The idea that papal legates, cardinals from Rome, that's fine, they can come in here, but they have a real limit to what they can do because sovereignty in England is held by England, not the Pope.
Yeah. And so, in other words, when Henry VIII is making these decisions, he's got precedent on his side.
Yes,
right?
He does.
Yeah. Right.
And he's playing fast and loose with those precedents, but the precedents are there. That's the point.
Yeah. So where does this go from here then? I mean, Henry VIII, is he thinking in terms of like some broader national vision? Like, does he have any other like political agenda? What else is he after in this decision? Is this just about like him saying, look, England is fed up with this. We've been doing this for so long. The popes have always tried to encroach upon our sovereignty, and we're done. Like is that what's going on here? Is it sort of the final straw, or is there something deeper?
No, I mean, I think that is all part of it. I think it is to secure his legacy. I mean, that is what is most important to kings, is their dynasty, their legacy, how they're going to be remembered, whether they've been able to establish peace for future generations. And this is one of Hans Hermann Hoppe's, I think, great points in his essay From Aristocracy to Monarchy to Democracy, where he says that monarchies are more future-oriented than democracies. That doesn't mean every king is wise and a great future thinker and planner, but they are incentivized economically to be future-oriented. Democracies are about living for today, living for the now, spending the money to get that will ingratiate with the people so that you can get the votes today. It'll be somebody else's problem, after I'm gone. I'll have the memorials, as this great legislator who spent all this money, right? That's how it works in democracy. Kings have to think about the inheritance, saying, is this monarchy going to be successful, or when my eyes close in death, is my kingdom going to be split apart by civil war? And that's going to be my legacy. So kings are more future-oriented in that respect. And I think that is the primary goal of Henry VIII, is to secure his monarchy to establish a lasting dynasty. And with that comes the desire to re-secure English sovereignty. So Henry VIII is not really a reformer. He wants to be a Catholic. He just wants to have the church in England subject to the laws of England and not bound by the Pope. And again, it goes back to, and I would say he's actually good on this, on his understanding of the ancient church, where you have bishops across the world that are seen as equally legitimate with the Bishop of Rome. And this is not just an English talking point either, or a English Reformation talking point. Go back to the Great Schism of 1054. The whole Eastern Orthodox Church agreed to this. Thought the same thing. Their whole issue with the Pope in that time was that he was acting like he's the ruler of the world over the whole East. And so this is not a new point either. The whole Eastern Orthodox Church agrees with this. And so he wanted that. He wanted laws to be made and enforced by English people in England. That's where you have, I mentioned the restraint of appeals before. No more appealing to the Pope as the final authority, as well as the annates, the restraint of the annates. England had, because it was part of Christendom, lots of monasteries, okay, and understandably, and this is one of the regrettable parts, I think, of what Henry did, is he dissolved the monasteries in England. And I think that's a really sad story and something that should not have been done. However, again, if we're going to try to get into Henry's mind and understand why he did it, well, one, they were really rich. They controlled a lot of wealth and he could pay his bills. That's the primary reason. But also, the monasteries, whenever in English law, if you are a rich person and you were a little unsure about your salvation, your standing with God, especially toward the end of your life, one of the things you could do to show your piety is to donate land or donate wealth to the church. And so for over years and years and years and years, people would do that. They would donate land to the church, or they would start a monastery. They'd give land to a monastery. And so the monasteries were extremely wealthy. The church in England, the Roman church, controlled about 1/6, a little less than 20% of the land in England was owned by the church based in Rome. So Rome would extract taxes and duties from all the clerics in England, as well as if you donated money to the church or to the monastery, that money would work its way back up to Rome, to the Bishop of Rome. And so the Annates, the restraint of the Annates bill, which actually was passed just 2 years before the official break, was saying, okay, we're not sending any more money to Rome. We're not going to allow Rome to continue to take money out of this country because of the church's land holdings. And so this is part of why the monasteries were dissolved. How do you rule a country when, say, almost 20% of the land you have no control or jurisdiction over? You know, how is that your country any longer? I mean, compare this in the United States. In states like Nevada and Utah, you know that like 95% of the territory is owned by the federal government, not the state. You might see that as a problem, you might not see that as a problem, but the fact is, compare that, again, it's a radically different figure, but thinking you are sovereign, you make the laws of the land, and anybody on about 20% of your land is excluded from the laws you make. How do you have sovereignty when you're, I mean, think about, maybe a better example would be, think about the corporations today in America, the multinational corporations. You know, how do you make laws in a country where multinational corporations own huge chunks of American land and have their own agenda? You know, or what if China was buying up American land? And we said, that's okay. Chinese are buying up American land. That's not a problem here. You know, I would think a lot of Americans would say, hey, let's reclaim the land from China and tell them to get out. So the same issue is going on here. And this is why, you know, it's quite fascinating, the parallels between the Reformation era in England and today. It really is a globalist versus nationalist debate. Yeah. The globalist institution at the time is the church. It's not what it is today. It's, you know, you have other globalist interests, but it is that dynamic, which is a fascinating one to explore, how these various nationalist movements in England, which were the Reformation movements, were pushing back against that.
Yeah. So what's the core point here? Why are we talking about this? I mean, obviously just understanding historical dynamics is important in general. But why should people care? What lessons can be drawn from this? You know, how relevant is it to, you know, Anglican thought and Anglican practice today? Yeah, it's a little bit of a tough one. But.
Well, I think it goes back to, first, the legitimacy question. So if you're hearing this and saying, okay, I've heard people, I know people that, you know, have become Anglican. I just started listening to this podcast, talks about Anglican stuff, but I just can't get around to the fact that this whole Anglican Church of England tradition just goes back to a capricious king who wanted a divorce. I think the point here is really that this Anglican tradition, there's a history of the Church in England with that title, The Church in England by J.H.R. Mormon. I really like that title because it's not the history of the Church of England, but the history of the Church in England. And so if we go back to what we were talking about again, I think in the second episode, the Anglo tradition is something that precedes the Reformation. The English Church precedes the Reformation. And it's important to understand that the separation, the formal separation that you see with the Act of Supremacy in 1534 and all that goes along with the English Reformation is not the start of something new. It was not a revolution to start a new church. It was an effort to reclaim national sovereignty for the English. I'm not saying everything about it is good. Any movement has not only the possibility, but almost a guarantee of going too far, of making mistakes. You know, any movement led by human beings has that possibility. And so the point here is not to make Henry VIII a saint. He surely was not. But it is to recognize that, one, the tradition is longer. The English tradition, the Anglican tradition, is longer than 5 centuries. Right. Second, that God uses political affairs, as we talked about halfway through this episode, political context, political affairs to forward his mission in the world. That this is not, and it should open our eyes as well to the reality of the current context in which we live. The idea that you're going to get reform without ever having to touch anything that smells like politics is a joke. Okay, and so you didn't get the Reformation. If you are a big time Reformation fan and you just eat that stuff up, you didn't get John Calvin, you didn't get Martin Luther, you didn't get any of the Reformations absent political maneuvering. And in this time where the church is in need of reform again, the idea that you're going to get reform of the church without having to get your hands dirty in anything political is also a joke.
Yeah, I think that's the one lesson that I've really digested over the last few years, is that I've really recognized the fact that this is all across the world. I mean, this is in Anglican circles, it's in Lutheran circles, it's in Reformed, Evangelical, Baptist circles, that the church is somehow sinning if it thinks in political terms, if it wants to approach politics. That doesn't mean you need to get up at the pulpit and talk about Donald Trump. That's not what we're talking about.
Right.
Politics is not evil. That's what we're saying, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There is a, there is such thing as over politicization.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, the idea we're not suggesting, we need, Donald Trump sermons or, we've got it that pastors feel like they need to take a stance on every issue. That's another problem, I think, maybe an episode for another day. But the idea that
a good guess for that.
The idea that we need every time a product comes out or a piece of legislation or somebody says something on the news, we need a reaction video from a pastor somewhere is not what we're talking about either. But the idea that there is power in the world that is going to be exercised by someone, and understanding who holds the power, understanding that power can be legitimate or not, and who is legitimate or not, and how power can be used for the greater glory of God and building of His kingdom, are not questions we should shy away from.
Well, yeah, I mean that. And then another thing too is like, a lot of people would hate us saying this, but the church could actually act as a special interest group, right? They could engage themselves politically on behalf of their own well-being, right? And that's something that's completely legitimate, but that is not acceptable within the modernist evangelical mind,
right?
So I think that concludes this episode. But I mean, obviously there are depths and levels of the break, from Rome that we should talk about. And we didn't even get into people like Cranmer or Cromwell or any of these other people too. I mean, there's the liturgical aspects of all of this.
Yep.
We basically just touched on the relationship between the king and the pope.
Right.
But there's so many other things here. So, Jared, thanks for another good discussion, and we'll see everybody in another week.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for joining us this week on Canterbury Trails. If you like what you hear, we'd appreciate your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing on whatever platform you're hearing us. Stay tuned for more weekly episodes, and we'll see you next time on the Canterbury Trails.